El profesor Göran Therborn estudió ciencia política y economía en la Universidad de Lund, Suecia, e hizo su doctorado en sociología en 1974. A los 60 años, se destacó como uno de los principales intelectuales de la nueva izquierda en Suecia. Es autor de más de una docena de libros. El más reciente se tituló La desigualdad y los laberintos de la democracia. De 1996 a 2006 fue codirector del Colegio Sueco de Estudios Avanzados en las Ciencias Sociales en Uppsala. Ha sido profesor visitante en varias ciudades, desde Madison, Wisconsin a Buenos Aires, Teherán y Seúl en Asia, en la Universidad Nacional de Australia y en Europa, desde Budapest a París en la Sorbonne y Pompeu Fabra en Barcelona. En 2006 fue nombrado catedrático de Sociología en la Universidad de Cambridge. Desde su jubilación en 2010, continúa enseñando en Cambridge como profesor emérito y es también afiliado a la Universidad de Lund en Suecia. Ha recibido 3 doctorados honoris causa y es miembro de la Academia de las Ciencias Sociales en Reino Unido.
Pues aquí estamos de manteles largos en Diálogos por la Democracia porque tenemos de invitado a uno de los grandes sociólogos de nuestros tiempos. Ya vieron su biografía. Göran Therborn nos visita desde Suecia. Aquí está con todos ustedes, con todos nosotros. Welcome, dear Göran, to the National University.
Thank you, John.
It's a real privilege to have you. You traveled for over 20 hours, right? To come from Sweden. What is your city that you live in Sweden?
Well, I live in the countryside, but the nearest town is Kalmar, close to the Baltic in the southeast of Sweden, and it's in the periphery of Sweden. A bit like, Sweden is on the periphery of the world, and transport and communications are always complicated.
And you came through Copenhagen, then to Paris, then to Mexico City.
Right, yeah.
And you've been here before to the UNAM?
Yes, I've been here several times. The first was actually more or less exactly 50 years ago. I was visiting a friend of a friend who lived here and still lives here. I've been to the international and the American sociology congresses, and then I went down to Mexico City and was here for about a month.
Really?
And then in the next time I was here, I guess, was in 1978. It was an intellectually very exciting time. I was attached to Flaxo, Mexico, which at that time, was full of bright minds from South America.
Exactly. I worked there for myself. My first couple of years of my career was at the Flaxo, Mexico, too.
So, yes, and after that I've been here on and off, but not that often. And now I think it's almost 10 years since I was here.
And what are your general impressions of Mexico, historically, culturally, politically? When you think of Mexico, what comes to your mind?
Well, I'm very impressed, by Mexican culture, its cultural history, but also its modern history and the interrelations between the revolution and the arts, all the murals and all that, and the Mexican Revolution. Is one of the greatest events of the 20th century. And it was a bit of an enigma, how it happened or how it got the consequences it did. I've been reading a bit about it, but I'm certainly no historian of the Mexican Revolution. And so I felt, well, I wouldn't say I felt at home. That would be a bit too much, because it's very there are many cultural and social differences between Scandinavia and Mexico. But I felt very comfortable here, and I've had very good times here. So I'm glad to be back, and I'm very honored to have been invited to your great series of lectures here in your program.
It was an honor for us to have you precisely at the 114th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution, the 20th of November, to have you as our keynote speaker to open our international colloquium that we do every year at the program on democracy, justice, and society. Before getting to the specific topic that you talked about, your books, your vast academic, intellectual production, one of the central topics is thinking about democracy, thinking about Western liberal democracy, its specific form, and how it has failed to live up to the hopes and dreams of the most radical French revolutionaries, American revolutionaries, Mexican revolutionaries, Russian revolutionaries. What has happened? Why has liberal democracy fallen so flat?
Well, I mean, we have to distinguish different cases and so on. Particularly the global north on one hand and the global south on the other. I've been dealing a bit with both, but particularly with the global north, and there, I mean, we can see already from the very beginning the seeds of decay, in the sense that the labor movement and then somewhat later the women's movements were the main social forces fighting for democracy in Europe, and they did so because they wanted to use democracy for social change, for changing society, under diverse circumstances. I mean, they did actually get democratic rights and democratic institutions, but it's noteworthy that victory was never total and was never won directly at the peak of battle, but rather when there had been a battle, not necessarily armed, but I mean demonstrations, strikes, and various manifestations. When these demands and these manifestations, claiming them, had passed their peak and was going down, then there opened a space for negotiation with the ruling classes, and that meant that both institutionally and politically, there was always a certain social limitation to the to liberal democracy. But we should also, of course, remember that the Marxian prediction of the tendency of industrial capitalism to generate its opponent and making its opponent larger and larger and more organized came true. And this influence culminated in the years of late 1960s, 1970s. But then came the economic crisis, the reorganization of the world economy, and the decline of industrial capitalism in the centers of capitalism, its replacement by finance, which is much less, it's basically independent of workers and so on. As the cream on the pudding, there arrived neoliberal politicians and neoliberal ideologues, and we had a counter-reformation starting around 1980 in Britain and the UK, and in the world with the military coup in Chile in 1973. And since then, liberal democracy has been restricted, has been in processes of gradual erosion, and the euphoria also in progressive circles of the spread of liberal democracy to Eastern Europe. Liberal democracy actually was from the very beginning linked to the worst kinds of neoliberalism. And
we could even, sorry for the interruption, but continue with the dialogue. We could even speak of neoliberal democracy. I sometimes put neo in parentheses because it's still liberal democracy because it's the ideas of liberal democracy, but it's morphed into, it's transformed into neoliberal democracy. In this historical account you're offering to us, it's interesting also to see the interplay between neoliberal economics and neoliberal politics. No?
Yeah.
I'm not so sure which came first. Perhaps one of the most important pushes for empowering finance capital is precisely to disempower the working class. And then once the power is there, it gives you the power to continue to disempower the working class. So it's kind of a dialectical cycle, no?
Yes.
Neoliberal politics and neoliberal economics, no?
yes, absolutely. I mean, and you saw that from the very beginning. I mean, in the how the military junta and its Chicago economists, one of the first major economic and political, economic and social changes was the abolition of the civic pension system in order to promote financial capitalism in Chile. Everybody was have to have to make a contribution to financial funds run by finance capitalists of various kinds and so on. I mean, there you can see how class politics and neoliberal financialism, I mean, were intertwined. So yes, that's true. And but the relationship was also this one. The neoliberal ideologues and politicians would never have succeeded, or at least would never have been able to stay in power unless there had been these structural changes in capitalism. The new, more competitive world economy, globalization, the outsourcing, and the drastic decline of industrial capitalism in the centers of capitalism, and thereby the drastic decline of the industrial working class itself.
Now, the collapse of legitimacy of neoliberal democracy is good news, theoretically, right? Because it's we've kind of pulled off the mask of the system that presented itself as being progressive, and in some at some moment was progressive, 50s,
Oh, yeah.
60s, 70s, but now it's kind of collapsed, and the neoliberal establishment, or the political scientists, traditional ones, lament deeply, no, the rise of populism, the rise of illiberal leaders. But this is also an opportunity, no? The collapse of the consensus, the neoliberal democracy consensus, creates a space for new forms of political innovation. Do you see that happening, where either at
Yes,
the local or national or global
yes,
level?
Yes and no. The space which was opened up, what you mentioned, in most cases, it was filled by new right-wing parties, or so-called right-wing populists, and so on. Xenophobic parties, and right. So that is a real tragedy, because I mean these new right-wing forces captured the popular the audience, captured the popular classes. The first breakthrough of that was the Front National in France.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after the fiasco of the common program and the left government of Mitterrand, by the mid-1990s, the Front National was clearly the party of the French working class, the largest party, and has remained so basically ever since, with some short interruptions. And you have this phenomenon of Trump in the US and so on, which is really remarkable, and something which you have seen examples of in Latin American populism earlier, I think, but for North Americans and for Europeans was something almost unbelievable. I mean, here you have an archetypical capitalist scoundrel with nothing much to go for it, but he manages to capture the imagination, the hopes of the abandoned popular classes. And he even managed to do this in this the elections of 2024. I mean, after all his rather mediocre, although not catastrophic, management of the state in his first period, but then this avalanche of court cases and of fraud and sexual scandals and lots of things. Nevertheless, I mean, the popular masses, I mean, stick to him in a way like the Peronistas did to Perón.
I'm going to stop you for a second. We have to go to a very brief break to continue with this very important analysis of contemporary and historical analysis of democracy. Ahorita nos vemos. Vamos a un breve corte comercial. Te esperamos. Continuamos aquí con el gran sociólogo sueco, el doctor Göran Therborn. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Thank you, Göran, for your time. So you were just starting to make a very interesting comparison between Trump and Perón. What's happening? How has Trump and Le Pen, father, daughter in France, been able to tap into this working class anxiety and protest?
I guess the main reason, and that's the tragedy, I mean that the working class and the popular classes had been abandoned by the established parties, not only the right-wing parties, but also the centrist reform parties.
Socialists, no?
And socialists, yes. And you had I mean, in the more recent cases, I mean, you had the crumbling of communism. I mean, the once very large and very respected in all circles Italian Communist Party has completely disappeared, and the French Communist Party, I mean, it's just and go to school. Let's say so. I mean, without any ideas and any support, anything, and social democracy was neoliberalized. I mean, that's a very important part of the rise of right-wing populism and liberal democracy. The fact that European social democracy, East and West, was neoliberalized, the so-called third way, Tony Blair and so on, and some of the worst cases of neoliberalized social democracy came in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. There were reformed ex-communists who started new social democratic parties that were encouraged from the West, got a lot of money and so on. And they had a good chance, I mean, to put Eastern Europe on a path of social reform, but they didn't. On the one hand, I mean, most of them turned out to be incredibly corrupt, but even worse, I mean, was that they abandoned the popular classes. I mean, they wanted to make Eastern Europe salongsfähig in Western Europe, and so they focused on criteria of neoliberal economics and to adapt Eastern Europe to the demands of NATO and the European Union. And the popular classes, I mean, just got fed up with this. And Viktor Orban in Hungary, who originally was the leading neoliberal politician in Hungary, as a young communist, anti-communist, and he realized that a space had opened up for right-wing conservatism, combining a kind of social concern, at least expressing some social concern with the people, and also doing this in policies and so on. The same thing with the Kaczynski twins in Poland. So, I mean, the space which was opened up, as you said, by the loss of legitimacy of liberal democracy was captured by the right because these popular classes had been abandoned. That didn't matter. I mean, neoliberals didn't care for losers. Trump doesn't do that either, but he managed. I mean, he has that must be said and so on. I mean, has a political instinct which is remarkable. The well-known loser of everybody weak and loser, he became the hero of the losers of the popular classes in the United States. But there's one more thing I would like to add before we leave your important topic, because the legitimacy of liberal democracy did open up for a while a space which was filled also by progressive forces. That developed around the millennium, there was the alter-globalists, the anti-globalization movement, and there was also very interestingly, particularly in Southern Europe, a new democratic movement.
And in Mexico, in Mexico, we had the Zapatista uprising at the same time.
That is something similar. And there was a once quite powerful student movement in Spain, which produced the party of Podemos, which has at maximum had a support of 15-16% of the population. And their main slogan was democracia ya, democracy now. But they were outplayed by various forces, both on the reformist left and on the far right and so on, and is now shadow. So that kind of protest movements which did happen, did generate, that's exactly as you predicted. And in order to underline perhaps the weight of this, is that there is a study of protest movements in the world by a Harvard scholar, Erika Chenoweth, who has found out that the decade of the 2010s was the decade with the largest number of anti-government protests in the world. There was no decade from 1900 to 2020. The largest amount of
Protests.
Of these protests. She calls them revolutions, which is a bit too much.
Between 2010 and 2020?
Sorry?
Between 2010 and 2020?
Yeah,
decade?
that was yeah.
More than the 60s?
Yes, apparently, yes. Well, I mean, this is on a global scale,
Right.
And there was the input from the Arab Spring, and
Right.
there was the effect of the crisis of 2008,
Right.
and well, I mean, her methodology can be discussed and so on, but
But it was
yes,
a major.
it was larger, slightly larger than in the 1960s. According to this kind of measurement.
And so, in fact, this new wave of the right wing can be read perhaps as a response to that global uprising, no? And that brings us back to
some extent, yes.
That brings us back a century, right? So you mentioned Perón. So Perón, his first big government job was as Secretary of Labor for a fascist, neo-fascist government in Argentina, right? So we're talking about, original fascism 100 years ago was also in response to an upsurge of working class organization.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Italy and Germany, no mistake that's where Mussolini, Hitler took power, because those were where we had strong communist organization in both of those countries.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right.
And
yes.
so this right wing, Trump, Macron, is in some ways
kind of a pendulum movement.
Exactly. Well, that's my question. To what extent is it just kind of a collapse, no? Or to what extent is it just sort of a dialectical equilibrium, which would mean that, in fact, the popular forces are building under the surface, and we might have a good new turn of events soon? Or is that just wishful thinking, right?
I think, as a sociologist, I think I would say that the chances for a return to strength of popular forces in the short run are fairly small. There are movements active everywhere and built up and so on, but for instance, I mean, the industrial working class has now shrunk enormously in the north, and in the global south it will never become big. And here in Latin America, deindustrialization has already started, so there will be no input from that whole. On the other hand, it's true, I mean, that the women's movements, and particularly perhaps in a country like Mexico, are stronger than ever. And but a crucial question of the 20th century, I think, is the climate crisis.
Well, the 21st century, right?
Yeah, the 21st century. Yes, yeah, right. Well, in a sense, it's a kind of privilege to have lived in two centuries. But
right.
Sometimes you messed them up.
My daughter always says to me, you're so 20th century, Dad. Right? But you're talking about the 21st century in terms of the climate crisis. How is that going to impact politics?
Yeah, well, that's the crucial question, and I've no prediction and so on. I mean, but I think this is where the 21st century politics will be decided. And I would say that currently the progressive forces are sliding backwards in influence and initiative. Originally, there was a fairly broad movement. It was called, in US-inspired countries, a Green New Deal, combining a radical social change of inequality and a change of the fossil fuel economy system. But that kind of project, I think, has now been stopped in the cradle, and there are many reasons for that, and so on. But it is basically Social Democrats, for instance, in Europe, are now opting for what is more or less explicitly called a green capitalism.
Mm-hmm. The green parties in Europe, in general, have kind of shifted towards the
center,
center, right?
Extremely fast to the right, yes. Mm-hmm. And but it's so. I mean, the future of the rest of the century will very much depend on whether green capitalism can succeed, or whether, I mean, the new alliances between green capitalism and an oil capital, which has been after taking some whipping, is now, I mean, back on the offensive, extending that drilling in number of countries. Both in Europe, in North America, in Latin America, in Africa, and the climate catastrophe has already started, and will only get worse.
And you have this incredible irony, right, of the United States presenting itself as innovating towards green capitalism, Obama, etc., and now putting tariffs or actually prohibiting the importation of Chinese electric cars, right?
Yes.
This battle between oil and environmentalism, no?
Yes. Well, that is you touched there upon a thing which is I think is very important, and which I will take up a bit further, which is the change from neoliberal globalization, which we have talked about, and of which none of us is an admirer, but its successor is certainly not better. I mean, the return to imperial geopolitics. Now, I mean, free trade, free capital movements are no longer the economic and political aces. Instead, I mean, there is national security, national interest, and this kind of, and this has also happened with the electrical cars, for instance. I mean, now everything has to be done to keep China down and to destroy Russia. And that means, I mean, that there isn't much space left on the centrist or right-wing agenda for any climate policies. And we can see, I mean, the backtracking of the European Commission and its on its climate previous climate commitments, and but I mean, this is of course a very risky strategy on the right-wing part, because the climate catastrophe can very well be absolutely catastrophic, and then all the political cards will be reshuffled, and the climate crisis is actually something which anti-capitalists should pay much more attention to than we have done so far, because a new economic system and a new accumulation system adapted to the climate situation is a new potential political trump card to left. Those of us who have lived through the 20th century know that what finally made capitalism the victor of the 20th century was that in the end, I mean, it showed to be more capable of providing high economic growth and economic development. Even Deng Xiaoping, an old revolutionary from the Long March, recognized that. And the left has not had, I mean, there have been many left critiques of capitalism, but they are still standing. But this thing about a system which has been able to deliver, if not to everybody, but to a substantial body of world population. This changes now with the climate crisis. Now the sustainable economy has to subordinate capital accumulation to the necessity of a sustainable fossil-free economy. So that is a potential trump card which hasn't been played yet, but can be played and might even take the table in the end.
Good, very important. Capitalism presented itself as life facilitating, no? It's the consumption, growth, and if we can see that capitalism means actually death, destruction, sickness, you know, we could turn the tables. I'm going to second commercial break. Vamos a un segundo corte comercial muy rápidamente. Regresamos para redondear y terminar esta conversación tan estimulante con el doctor Göran Therborn, que nos visita desde Suecia. No se vaya. Muchas gracias por continuar con nosotros. Aquí estamos con Göran Therborn. Göran, in your keynote address in our international colloquium, you put forth a new categorization, a new theory. You propose that we start thinking about the concept of genocidal democracy, which breaks with the tradition of thinking that democracy goes with peace, democracy goes with freedom. And here we have a situation in the Middle East in which we have a democratic country. Israel freely elects its leaders, but is committing genocide against other peoples. Why is it so important to rethink democracy in this context, and what does it imply in terms of thinking about this political form?
Well, one main reason is that precisely this argument you mentioned, which has been around, that democracies can't be evil. And Israel is a democracy, and therefore, of course, I mean, we can trust it to obey with international humanitarian law. That was European politicians have been saying all the time. And now, I mean, we see, I mean, everybody has seen on the TV screens or on other media how a whole population is being destroyed. 90% displaced, 80% of their housing has been destroyed, and 5% of the population has been killed. And this is done, obviously done by Israel, a democracy. And now, I mean, the fact that a democracy can make war crimes and crimes against humanity has also been confirmed by the International Court of, by the International Criminal Court, whose verdict came just yesterday. So it's really. Now, how is this possible? Well, the theory and history of democracy has most of the time been very Eurocentric and very nation-centric. Democracy has been discussed in terms of national politics. But we should remember that democracy, liberal democracy, modern liberal democracy, emerged at the same time as the high tide of European imperialism and colonialism. Now, the connection between the two are not that strong and rather complex. I won't go into that. But there is one thing which is very important for when we think about democracy. Normally, I mean, we talk about democracy in terms of one people, one nation, and its relation to the rulers and so on. But imperialism and colonialism always creates political units of two or more peoples, of the homeland and the colonies. And the question then comes up to, when these colonies want to constitute a nation and a nation state. Well, what people shall be the nation? What people has a right to build a nation here? And there are two different options. One was the one wisely chosen by the leaders of Latin Hispanic American independence. It should be a union of the settlers and their descendants on the one hand, and the indigenous population on the other. We are all Mexicans now, or Americanos, as we said at the time, or all Peruanos. But the other answer was that we, the whites, we are the only people, and the others are sort of, well, happen to be here and so on.
South Africa, the United States, no?
Yeah, in the United States, South Africa, Australia, Canada, and then comes the question. I mean, what do you do with if you create a white nation state, or what would you do? What do you do with the indigenous people? Well, if the indigenous people are not very many and they are very poor, they can just be marginalized and, of course, without any political and civic rights, but they just sort of, like in the Aborigines in Australia, the Inuits in Canada, and but if the indigenous people are rather many, but militarily weak, they have to be and can be either deported or killed off, or both. And this was what happened. A predecessor to Joe Biden, the founder of the Democratic Party, Andrew Jackson, when he was president of the U.S. in the 1820s, his most famous act as a president, he was also a war hero, was the Indian Removal Act, which declared that all Indians have to be deported west of Mississippi.
The Trail of Tears.
Yeah,
no?
the Trail of Tears, like the Trail of Tears of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. But there was also the another solution, which was a genocidal solution. And the first known case of explicitly genocidal democracy was the state of California, when it was conquered from Mexico and annexed into the United States. It had a democratic constitution with universal male suffrage and elected leadership and so on. And its two first governors explicitly declared a war of extermination against the Indians. So taking us back to the genocidal democracy of Israel, it doesn't have anything Jewish to it. It's completely structural. You have two peoples. You have a settler state, which Israel is, and was given as an imperial gift by the British Empire, and then established as a Jewish nation state, expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, although there were quite a few left in Palestine. And the Israeli government, from the very beginning, had the goal of recruiting as many Jewish immigrants as possible to Palestine to make it ever more exclusively Jewish. And this has now reached a genocidal point, because the accelerating immigration of immigrants are demanding space, new settlements. The Palestinians are refusing to move. The neighbor states are refusing to accept deportees from Israel. There wasn't a plan to try to export the Palestinians to Congo and to pay the Congolese for it. But that was too scandalous when this plan came out in Africa, so the Congolese government backed down. So this is the background. It's a general genocidal war when a settler state refuses to live together with the indigenous population and give them equal rights.
There's even a reading within the same idea of Nazi Germany. I was reading, I think it was Domenico Lo Surdo, characterizing Nazi Germany as the self-application of colonial principles. A kind of, that's why people are even saying, no, how is it possible that the Israelis are now applying the same principles as Nazi Germany? And what you're saying is that both of them are part of an even longer tradition, no? That goes back, or is that going too far to categorize Nazism, fascism as also a part of this genocidal democracy?
Well, no, Nazism is obviously was genocidal, but it wasn't a democracy. It was not a genocidal, not a democracy. It was
Hitler came into power through elections,
regime. Right? And interesting enough, I mean, even Hitler didn't dare to talk in public about we must exterminate the Jews. There's no speech on that.
Really?
But
so Netanyahu
that doesn't take away, I mean, all the millions of Jews who were killed, but the Nazis didn't dare to talk about it.
Really? Is that true?
Yeah,
I didn't
that's
know that.
true.
Hitler never. So Netanyahu is more explicit than.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Hitler.
And Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and all those guys. Yes. Yeah.
And Hitler did come into power through elections. Right?
That's true. Yes.
And then reverted them. But
but I would like to add one thing about the Israeli genocidal democracy is at least is easily understandable. I mean, from this as a legacy from European imperialism and the conflict between the settlers and the indigenous population is a bit more difficult to explain why all the leading liberal democracies in the world have supported the genocide.
That's this other point, right?
Not just tolerated it, but sort of every month during the war, the United States, Germany, and the UK, more and more irregularly, the UK and the Netherlands and Canada are sending bombs, ammunitions, weapons of various sorts, probably fighter planes as well, in order for Israel to stock up, to continue this genocidal operation. This is an absolute, not only a tragedy, is a crime. And I would say, that with this constellation, this genocidal constellation of Israel and its supporters and protectors, this is the darkest times of democracy since January 1933. Yesterday, the International Criminal Court did actually indict Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense, General Gallant, and at least some European democracies have said, that we will follow that. We will. Italy have said so. Netherlands have said so. Spain can be expected to say that. Britain, we don't know yet, and Germany probably will not. But I don't think this will change any much. It's a good sign that there is still, some parts of international law which is at least alive, although it doesn't have any power.
Those are powerful words, Göran. The worst state of democracy since 1933.
Well, so it looks, yes, unfortunately.
But the hope is in the South, right? We have one more minute, but give us a word of hope from the South, because that was how you finished your conference.
No, I ended my talk by saying, now it's up to the global South to stand up for international law and fundamental human rights. And South Africa has played an absolutely magnificent role in bringing, the genocidal case against Israel. That's the way the global South should go, that path of standing up for international law and human rights. And that is something, that's a force which is growing. The decline of the West is not accelerating very fast, but it is declining, and the global South influence is growing in the world. So after all, even though this may be the darkest day of democracy since 1933, there are, like so many times at the darkest moment, dawn is not very far away.
Wonderful, Göran. Let's finish on that note. A real privilege to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Göran. Muchas gracias a nuestro público. Una cátedra muy profunda, muy importante, muy necesaria. Nos vemos de nuevo en 8 días aquí en TV UNAM, en tus diálogos por la democracia. Te esperamos.